I'll be presenting some of the results of my honours thesis, which I completed last year at the University of Melbourne, but I've been a linguistics intern at the Goldfields Aboriginal Languages Centre for the last couple of weeks, and so I'm really grateful for the opportunity and the platform to present some of my research here. My thesis was a first language acquisition study of nominalised clauses in Pitjantjatjara. So here's the structure of my presentation. I'll begin with a very brief overview of Pitjantjatjara country and language. I'll explain why first language acquisition research is important and what some of the practical benefits of first language acquisition research can be for communities, how FLA research can further the cause of language sovereignty. I'll introduce nominalised clauses in Pitjantjatjara. I'll explain their structure and their function, what I'm actually talking about when I use the term nominalised clauses. I'll contextualise my research by looking at some acquisition research from other languages. I'll present 4 of the main findings from my research, discuss these findings in a cross-linguistic context, and then of course there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. And just to clarify, before I start speaking, by first language acquisition research, what I mean is the investigation of how children acquire their first language in a naturalistic setting. So how children go from being little humans who don't speak to little humans who do speak just by being in proximity to people using a language. Okay, so Pitjantjatjara country and language, for those of you who aren't already aware, Pitjantjatjara is a language spoken in the tri-state border region of South Australia, the Northern Territory and Western Australia. It's one of the languages spoken in the Goldfields region. It's a language that belongs to the Palmanungan language family, and it's part of the Western Desert dialect chain, which means that it shares a number of grammatical and lexical similarities with some of the languages that are geographically adjacent to it. In an Australian context, it's a strong language. So it's got about 3,000 speakers, and it's one of only about 14 Australian languages still being acquired as a first language by children, which naturally makes it a good candidate for first language acquisition research. And it's strong to the extent that it's incorporated as part of a bilingual education curriculum at Areyonga Bilingual School. So children are instructed in both Pitjantjatjara and in English, with English being introduced gradually as the children move through the year levels. So in an Australian context, Pitjantjatjara is a strong language. In a global context, it's still a smaller language, considering that a language like English has 1.5 billion speakers, and it's certainly a language that has not had that much first language acquisition research conducted with it. So why is it important to conduct first language acquisition research, and why should we be interested in how Pitjantjatjara is being acquired by children? To take a step back for a moment, in 2022, 2 researchers conducted a meta-analysis of the 4 major first language acquisition research journals. So they conducted an analysis of all the analysis that had been conducted in these journals. And what they found was that since the mid-20th century, the 4 major FLA journals have published research articles looking at the acquisition of just 1.47% of the world's approximately 7,000 languages. Over 80% of the research articles published in these journals just looked at the acquisition of widely spoken and, I guess you'd say, grammatically homogenous Indo-European languages. And quite astonishingly, over half of the research articles published in these journals since the mid-20th century just looked at the acquisition of English. Now, this sampling bias towards a small set of grammatically homogenous and widely spoken languages poses a number of significant problems for the field of linguistics. How are we supposed to draw general conclusions about first language acquisition when we've only looked at the acquisition of 1.47% of the world's approximately 7,000 languages? One of the motivating questions of first language acquisition research is how do children with the same cognitive machinery acquire the diversity of the world's languages? And we're not even close to answering that question when we've only looked at how 1.47% of the world's languages have been acquired. It also means that when we do look at the acquisition of smaller and grammatically diverse languages, it's really difficult to contextualize this research because the literature is so dominated by a small set of related languages. There's also a sense of urgency here because those same languages which have not been the subject of first language acquisition research are also the languages that are losing speakers most quickly. This is something especially pertinent for us here in Australia, where we have, unfortunately, one of the highest rates of language endangerment in the world. And often it is that youngest generation of speakers that are the first to stop speaking a traditional language. So if we want to figure out how children are acquiring smaller and grammatically diverse languages, time is of the essence to do so before children stop acquiring these languages as a first language. But there are a number of practical benefits to FLA research that I think are worth mentioning, benefits that go straight to communities. For example, FLA research is really important in designing bilingual language curricula. So I mentioned the Arayonga Bilingual School a little earlier. FLA research can provide an insight into what the typical English and Pitjantjatjara language skills are for children at different ages so that classroom content can be designed accordingly. FLA research is really important in creating good language materials. We heard from the Indigenous Literacy Foundation a few days ago who create readers and storybooks for remote communities in language around Australia. And in the case of readers, FLA research can give you an insight into what sort of content, grammatical content, should you be putting into readers directed for children at different ages. FLA research is also really important in reducing the bias that exists in language assessment. So right now, a lot of the tools that we use to assess a child's linguistic skills assume that they speak English as a first language. And if they speak Pitjantjatjara or Creole or Murunpata or another language as a first language, then they're not going to be given a fair chance to showcase their linguistic skills. FLA research is also important in establishing baselines so that children can be accurately assessed for any language delays that might be present as well. Once again, a lot of the diagnostic tools that speech pathologists use in remote communities assume that a child speaks English as a first language. And if they speak another language as a first language, they may be overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or not provided with the treatment plans that they need to address any language delays that might be present. So I said before that in an Australian context, Pitjantjatjara is a strong language. In a global context, it's still a smaller language. And it's a similar story when we look at the amount of linguistic research that's been conducted with Pitjantjatjara. In an Australian context, it's quite a well-documented and well-researched language. I've just included a list of some of the recent linguistic studies. But in a global context, it's still an underrepresented language, especially in FLA or first language acquisition research. That hasn't had a great deal of research conducted with Pitjantjatjara speakers. I'll just mention some resources that were really useful for me in conducting my research. Sasha Wilmoth's recent PhD thesis, looking at how young people or young adults are speaking Pitjantjatjara in Pukaja, South Australia, was a really good up-to-date guide on how the language is spoken in one particular area today. Wanyama Whiten's honours thesis from 2021, looking at how children are acquiring the verbal forms in Pitjantjatjara, was also a really useful resource for me in comparing some of my results. And then an older but still useful resource was Cliff Goddard's Grammar of Yankunytjatjara, which still contains a lot of really useful information about Pitjantjatjara because Yankunytjatjara is one of those Western Desert languages that shares a number of grammatical and lexical similarities. Okay, so let's get into nominalised clauses. I'll begin by looking at their structure, and then I'll move into the variety of functions that they can play in Pitjantjatjara. So minimally, in their simplest form, a nominalised clause is any clause where you have a verb with an affix attached to it called a nominaliser. And what you need to know about this nominaliser is that it makes the verb look and behave more like a noun. And one of the ways that this manifests is that the nominalised verb is able to take a case suffix, which in many cases can determine the semantic function of the nominalised clause. So you might have a nominalised clause that looks something like this example, Pitjantjatjara, where you have the Pitjantjatjara verb for come, pitja, nominalised, ntja, and then affixed by the dative gu suffix on the end. So that's what it looks like structurally. And they have, well, I look at 4 main functions of nominalised clauses in my research. I'll get into some detailed Pitjantjatjara examples in just a moment, but I've just included some English examples up here by way of an introduction into these clause functions. They can function as subordinate complement clauses, as subordinate adverbial clauses, and by subordinate here I mean that they are embedded within a main clause. They can also function as insubordinate requests for states of affairs, and they're also used in instances of clausal negation. So let's have a look at what these look like in Pitjantjatjara. In this first example here, the orange nominalised clause, and we can tell that it's a nominalised clause because that verb break has the nominalising morpheme attached to it in bold with the locative case suffix on the end. The orange nominalised clause is fulfilling the role of the object of the main clause verb here. So here is a transitive verb. To make sense, you have to hear something. And in this case, the entire nominalised clause is fulfilling the function of the object of the verb here, yielding the translation, maybe he heard the little eggs hatching. So the little eggs hatching is that content of the nominalised clause. In this second example, the orange nominalised clause, and note again the verb with the nominalising morpheme attached to it and then the case suffix on the end. The nominalised clause is providing additional information to a main clause verb. So it's got an adverbial function. In this case, it's providing a reason or rationale for why a main clause verb is occurring. So you were singing so that the car would come.
Could you tell us what an ACNMLZ is?
Okay, yeah, so that's NMLZ is for nominaliser, and AC, there's a small mistake there. That should be a full stop there. That is stands for action nominalisation. There are 2 main types of nominalisation in Pitjantjatjara. It's not that relevant for the purposes of this presentation, the distinction between them, but action nominalisation is when you nominalise a verb and the result is you're referring to the action in a nominal form, and then there's agent nominalisation where you're referring to someone who is doing the action.
I was going to ask what PROC is in the first. RDP, yeah, I was thinking break, proc.
Yeah. Sorry?
No, PROC, process or something.
Yeah, I think it is something like that. Yeah. So the case suffixes are also implicated in a switch reference system. What this means is that in subordinate clauses where the person or thing doing the action is different to the person or thing doing the action in the main clause, the nominalised verb is usually gu marked or dative marked. So we can see here that the person singing is different to the thing coming. Like we have a person singing but a car coming in the subordinate clause. And so to mark that the subjects are different, we have the nominalised verb dative marked. Whereas in this second example here, the person or thing doing the action in the subordinate clause is the same as the person or thing doing the action in the main clause, and the nominalised verb is intentive marked instead, so gitcha marked. So the person taking is the same as the person planting, and so to mark that it's the same subject in each clause. It's Gitja marked instead. Although recently this distinction has been called into question. Sasha Wilmoth, for example, in her PhD thesis, records a number of same subject subordinate clauses that are dative marked, so gut marked, instead of Gitja or intentive marked. And it's not entirely clear what is permitting the use of the dative suffix in this environment, but I'll discuss this more a little later when I'm presenting some of my findings. The third main function of nominalised clauses is as insubordinate requests for states of affairs. So these are morphologically identical to subordinate clauses in that they comprise a nominalised verb and a case suffix, but they stand on their own. They're not embedded within a main clause. There is no second clause to which they are linked, hence the name insubordinate. And as you can see, that they're normally used to request a state of affairs. So here someone's sort of asking if they can eat using a nominalised an insubordinate nominalised clause. Goddard suggests that they function as oblique or polite requests for a state of affairs, but more recent data has shown that their function has expanded just to be a standard request for a state of affairs, not necessarily with a polite reading, but not necessarily with an impolite reading either.
Can it be any person? The subject be any person, not just first person?
As in, like, could they have an imperative function as well? As in, can you do this versus I want this?
Let's go.
Let's go. Yeah, from what I've seen, I think that's permissible. They're pretty widespread. The use of them is pretty widespread in everyday speech, from what I can see.
I mean, a sort of third person, may they, like God save the Queen, sort of.
No. From the data that I've analysed, it's very much expressing your own desire for a state of affairs. Okay, so the final function that I'll talk about is nominalised clause use in instances of clausal negation. So this is because in Pitjantjatjara, the negator wea modifies nominal elements only, or noun-like elements only. So if you want to say that somebody didn't do something, you have to first nominalise the verb before you can negate it. So we have here the verb learn, nominalised and then negated, yielding the translation, maybe they don't learn Pitjantjatjara at school.
So there's no like verbal specific negation. They must be nominalised, did you say? To be...
Generally, yes. Yeah. So if you want to mark like negative existence, you also use the wea, just modifying a normal nominal. But if you want to negate an entire clause, you have to nominalise the verb before you can do that. And Pitjantjatjara is not unique, but kind of unusual in that respect, that negation is a strictly nominal category rather than verbal. Okay, so what do we expect in nominalised clause acquisition given research on other languages? Well, we can see that nominalised clauses are pretty complex. In the case of subordinate clauses, they're syntactically complex because you're having to embed clauses as constituents of another clause. And in the case of all nominalised clauses, I'd say that they're morphologically complex as well because you're having to nominalise verbs and then combine the nominalised verb with a case suffix or a negator. And what we find in languages that have constructions with a similar degree of complexity is that they're acquired quite late in acquisition. So in Turkish, which is a good comparison because you also have to nominalise a verb if you want to use it in a subordinate clause, nominalised clauses aren't acquired productively until after the age of 4. And this is despite the fact, importantly, that children have acquired nominalising morphology well before this. So children know how to nominalise verbs. It just takes them quite a while to translate that morphological structure into a syntactically complex setting. And just a note here, this is the way I'll be representing ages in this presentation. So 4 years, 0 months in this example. In English, it's a similar story. Subordinate clauses aren't productively used until around the age of 4, maybe a little bit before. The earliest subordinate clauses we see are normally complement clauses of verbs like want, because as I'm sure it won't surprise anybody or most people to learn, children are often asking for things that they want. So this is a kind of useful thing to have in their linguistic arsenal at a relatively young age. And in the earliest stages of complex clause acquisition, it's really common to find children producing what look like subordinate clauses in the absence of a main clause to which they are linked. And note that they are kind of formally similar to the insubordinate clauses we looked at a few slides ago, that morphologically look like subordinate clauses without a second clause to which they are linked. So all this points towards nominalised clauses being acquired later in acquisition, maybe around the age of 4. But there are a few curveball factors that we have to take into consideration. The first one is that we saw that nominalised clauses carry a heavy functional load. They have a variety of functions in Pitjantjatjara's grammar. They can function as subordinate, adverbial and complement clauses, as insubordinate requests for states of affairs, and then they're also used in instances of clausal negation. What we might infer from this functional load is that children are likely to be surrounded by nominalised clauses as they're acquiring their first language. Caregivers, siblings, friends will have many causes to use nominalised clauses. And so therefore they may feature frequently in child-directed speech. And studies have shown that the more frequently a construction is used in child-directed speech, that is, the speech that a caregiver or friend directs towards a child that's acquiring their first language, the more frequent a construction is, the earlier it is acquired, even if it is a complex construction. So for example, in Inuktitut, a North American language, children acquire passive constructions unexpectedly early, a really complex construction, in part because they feature really frequently in child-directed speech. And similarly in English, children's comprehension of an object-relative clause improves dramatically when they're tested on clauses the researcher knows the child has heard recently. Another thing to take into account is that Wanyama Whiten, in his honours thesis looking at the acquisition of Pitjantjatjara verbal morphology, found that children are producing the nominalizer, that morpheme essential in creating nominalised clauses, unexpectedly early at around the age of 1.5 in negative constructions. And this is despite the fact that nominalising morphology is normally acquired very late in acquisition in other languages after the age of 5. So maybe the functional load of nominalised clauses and the frequency in child-directed speech that we may infer from that is overriding the complexity of nominalised clauses as a factor in the acquisition of this clause type. That's the central tension that I wanted to probe in my analysis, and the 3 sort of research questions that were guiding that analysis were: what is the acquisition trajectory of the morphology and syntax of nominalised clauses? How are children using nominalised clauses in acquisition? So what functions are they using? And then how do these acquisition trajectories compare to some other cross-linguistic research? A quick note on my methods. I analysed a corpus of around 7,000 transcribed child speech utterances. These recordings were made between 2016 and 2018 in Pitjantjatjara, South Australia. But these recordings were made by one of my honours supervisors, Rebecca Defina, in collaboration with a range of Pitjantjatjara families, caregivers and children. And so obviously this research wouldn't be possible without their collaboration. So very grateful to them. She recorded 22 children aged between 1 year, 9 months and 7 years, 8 months. And the way these sessions worked is that children were given a little backpack with a microphone attached to it, and they were told to go and play. And as children do, they would talk to their friends, they would talk to their caregivers, they would talk to themselves, and this speech formed the basis of the corpus that I analysed. The recordings were put into a program called Elan that allows you to transcribe these recordings. And then I was able to go into the Elan files and locate nominalised clauses by searching for the presence of the nominaliser using regular expressions, which is just a way of searching through large bodies of text. And then once these utterances were located, once the nominalised clauses were located, I put them in Excel and they were coded for a range of variables. So the age of the child that said the nominalised clause, what type of nominalised clause it was, if it was a subordinate nominalised clause, what the main clause verb was, and whether it was the same or different subordinate clause, what the nominalised verb was, if there was a case suffix, what case suffix it was, and then also what the word order in nominalised clauses was, just to see how children were arranging their words in this clause type. And there are four main findings that I'll share with you today. The first has to do with the sequence of acquisition of different nominalised clause types. The second has to do with the surprising infrequency of subordinate nominalised clauses across the corpus. The third has to do with the prevalence of insubordinate clauses and the implications that this has for Pitjantjatjara's switch reference system. And then I'll conclude by speaking about the age 3.5 as an important age in nominalised clause acquisition. Okay, so sequence of acquisition. What we find is that clausal negation is the first nominalised clause type to be acquired by children, followed by the acquisition of insubordinate requests for states of affairs, with subordinate nominalised clauses bringing up the rear. This is represented in this graph here, which records nominalised clause tokens. We have the youngest age brackets towards the left edge of the x-axis and the oldest age brackets towards the right edge of the x-axis. And what this means is that if a child used a nominalised clause at the age of 2 years, 7 months, they were placed at this data point here. So these ages here are the upper end of a 6-month age bracket. So 1 year, 6 months to 2 years, 2 years to 2 years, 6 months, 2 years, 6 months to 3 years, etc. And what we can see is that the instances of clausal negation represented by the blue squares appear earlier and in far greater numbers than the other two nominalised clause types, the insubordinate clauses represented by the red triangles and the subordinate clauses represented by the green diamonds. The first example of clausal negation appears at 1 year, 9 months with lots of phonological reduction, which is typical of child speech. So Andrew here, and all these names are pseudonyms. Andrew here uses, he's reduced the nominaliser to just a little affricate, and then the negator weir is almost affixed onto the nominaliser with the first sound elided. And that sort of phonological reduction is pretty typical of child speech. The first insubordinate clause appears at 2 years, 8 months. Here we have Daniel using an insubordinate clause with its typical function to request for a state of affairs. And here he is, in fact, asking somebody else to do something, directing his interlocutor to look at something on the ground using an insubordinate clause. And then the first subordinate clause appears at 3 years, 3 months. It's an object complement clause, so Daniel is expressing that he'd like to play at a nearby sandhill. So the orange nominalised clause is the object of the main clause verb want. And we can see that the gitja suffix is being used with its canonical same subject function to mark a same subject subordinate clause. So Daniel is both the person wanting and hopefully the person playing. So the gitja suffix is being used with its canonical same subject function in this instance. So this sequence isn't particularly unexpected. We knew from 1 year Mawaitan's work that the nominaliser was appearing in clausal negation at around the age of 1.5, 1 year, 9 months. And it also makes sense that insubordinate clauses would appear before subordinate clauses as they are syntactically simpler. They're not embedded as a constituent of a main clause. So presumably they present less of a learning challenge to children. And in fact, this has some similarities to the sequence of English subordinate clause acquisition, where a stage in subordinate clause acquisition is children producing what look like subordinate clauses in the absence of a main clause to which they are linked. What was surprising, however, was the profound infrequency of subordinate clauses across the entire corpus. In this table here, I've summarised the appearance of nominalised clause tokens. Got the youngest age brackets at the top, oldest age brackets at the bottom, and I've divided them by a clause function as well. And what we can see is that in a corpus of 7,000 child speech utterances, only 11 subordinate clauses are recorded. There are around 4 times as many insubordinate requests for states of affairs. And then clausal negation is the most frequent nominalised clause type, with 64 instances of clausal negation recorded across the corpus. This is just re-emphasised by this graph here, comparing the emergence of subordinate clauses to insubordinate clauses. We can see that the insubordinate clauses in red, the red triangles, appear earlier and in greater numbers than the subordinate clauses. So 79% of the non-negated clauses are insubordinate, and in all but one age bracket, the number of insubordinate clauses is greater than the number of subordinate clauses. The subordinate clauses we do record are normally used to ask an interlocutor to do something. So here we have Daniel asking an interlocutor to tell another person to open a container, and here we have Jane asking an interlocutor to tell another person to put something down. And in fact, of the 11 subordinate clauses that I record, so not a massive sample, wonka is used as a matrix verb 4 times. So children are often sort of demanding that another person tell somebody else something. I think that the prevalence of insubordinate clauses relative to subordinate clauses may be having an effect on Pitjantjatjara's switch reference system. So just to recap, we said that the dative gu suffix is normally used for subordinate clauses that have a different subject to the main clause, whereas the intentive gitcha suffix is used to mark subordinate clauses that share a subject with the main clause. We also said, though, that newer studies have called this, or suggested that this correspondence is a little bit blurry, with a number of same subject subordinate clauses in Wilmoth's study being dative marked instead of intentive marked. And indeed, this is a trend that continues in my data as well, or the data that I analysed. Of the 11 subordinate clauses, I record 8 are same subject subordinate clauses, and 7 of these 8 clauses are dative marked instead of intentive marked. So they're gu marked instead of gitcha marked. So why is this occurring? Why aren't we seeing the gitcha suffix being used with its described same subject function? I think looking at the behaviour of these suffixes in the context of the insubordinate clause might provide a clue in answering this question. So in the context of an insubordinate clause, children are using both dative and intentive marked nominalised clauses with exactly the same discourse function. So they're being used to request a state of affairs. Daniel here using a dative marked insubordinate clause to request a state of affairs, and then Denzel using an intentive gitcha marked insubordinate clause to request a state of affairs. So in this context, to some extent, the distinction between the dative and the intentive is being collapsed a little bit. There's a bit of a loss of distinction. In this context, there's also no main clause to share or differ in subject with, because insubordinate clauses stand on their own without a second clause to which they are linked, which means that the switch reference meanings that would typically be associated with the gitcha and the gu suffixes are bleached or made redundant. It's then possible that this loss of distinction between the gitja and the gu, which is introduced in the context of an insubordinate clause, spreads to the context of a subordinate clause when there is a main clause to share or differ in subject with. And this could be one reason for why we're seeing a more blurry switch reference distinction between the gitja and the gu suffix. Okay, 3.5 as an important age in nominalised clause acquisition. Returning to this snapshot of the nominalised clause tokens, we can see that the vast majority of nominalised clauses appear after the age of 3.5. That's a threshold represented by the red line in this table. And this holds for pretty much, or it does hold for subordinate nominalised clauses, insubordinate clauses, and clausal negation as well. In this table here, the red bars represent instances where a child innovates the nominalised clause construction by using a new verb in this context. So using a new verb in a nominalised clause is kind of noteworthy because it's an example of a child expanding the communicative possibility of the nominalised clause. And we can see that the number of verbal innovations, if you like, sparks dramatically between the age of 3.5 and 4, and then again between 4 and 4.5. Wanyama Whiten, in his acquisition study of Pitjantjatjara verbal morphology, finds that children expand their verbal vocabulary quite dramatically about a year earlier at 2.5. So it seems like it might take about a year for children to capitalise on this expanded verbal vocabulary for use in nominalised clauses. And then I mentioned word order a while ago. This table records the different word orders that we observe in nominalised clauses. Once again, the youngest age brackets at the top, oldest age brackets at the bottom. Pitjantjatjara is a flexible word order language, so you can rearrange the order of subject, object, and verb without affecting the overall meaning of the utterance. But we can see before the age of 3.5, children are extremely limited in the number of word orders that they use. They basically only use the verb-only utterances. And then after the age of 3.5, children begin to radically expand the number of possible word orders that they use in nominalised clauses until almost every logically possible word order for both transitive and intransitive verbs has been recorded by the oldest age bracket. And this is very much in line with children beginning to acquire a more adult-like understanding of nominalised clauses and clause structure at around the age of 3.5. It's an age at which children begin to use nominalised clauses more intensively, an age at which children begin to expand the communicative capability of nominalised clauses by using more verbs in this construction, and also an age at which they exhibit a more adult-like understanding of Pitjantjatjara clause structure. Okay, so bringing this back to the cross-linguistic discussion that we introduced at the beginning of this presentation. So although nominalised clauses may carry a heavy functional load and therefore may be frequent in child-directed speech, it certainly does not appear that this is precipitating the acquisition of subordinate nominalised clauses. The vast majority of nominalised clauses and subordinate clauses are observed after the age of 3.5, which is very much in line with that English and Turkish data that we saw at the beginning of this presentation. And I think that once again, the Turkish comparison is useful. If you recall, Turkish children didn't productively acquire subordinate clauses until after the age of 4, despite being able to nominalise verbs well before this. And it seems like a similar thing is occurring in Pitjantjatjara as well. Children know how to nominalise verbs, children know how to use case suffixes, but it's just taking them quite a while to translate these morphological structures into a syntactically complex setting. I also think that the function of insubordinate clauses and subordinate clauses might be one partial explanation for the infrequency of subordinate clauses across the corpus. We said that cross-linguistically, some of the earliest subordinate clauses are object complement clauses expressing desire, children saying things that they want. And indeed, this seems to be the case for Pitjantjatjara as well. Some of the subordinate clauses we looked at were used by children to request things or to demand things of interlocutors. But it seems like the insubordinate clause is also available as a way of achieving this discourse function. The insubordinate clause is a pragmatically acceptable way of expressing something that you want or something that you desire. And this to some extent mitigates the necessity for the use of subordinate clauses early in acquisition. If children want to say that they want a certain state of affairs and they have a choice between the syntactically simpler insubordinate clause and the syntactically more complex subordinate clause, it makes sense that they would opt to use the syntactically simpler insubordinate clause. There are, of course, avenues for future research. This was much of the discussion that I've just taken us through is underpinned by the assumption that the functional load of nominalised clauses would correspond to high frequency in child-directed speech. That is an assumption. It's not empirically backed. It would be really good to have child-directed speech data to see whether nominalised clauses are indeed frequent in child-directed speech, to see whether this is worth exploring as a factor in nominalised clause acquisition. Subordinate clauses were really infrequent across the corpus. It would be good to have more data from older children so that we can see if subordinate clause use picks up in older ages and what the pathway is into more intensive use of subordinate clauses. A few quick acknowledgements. Once again, thank you to the caregivers and children for allowing Rebecca to record the way that their young people are speaking Pitjantjatjara in Pukaja. This research isn't possible without them, so thank you, and I acknowledge them. And then also thank you to my supervisors, Rebecca, Defina, and Rachel Nordlinger, for their helpful comments on this project. Time for questions.
Was there research done with older children? Because I was going back to like you know, like the call comes in as a person you're pointing at yourself. Nyankum is like you just said, going back to that slide.
Yeah.
They merge the languages, like the two verbs into one. So it doesn't make it like action or non-action.
Wasn't a great deal of data from older children.
Yeah.
That's definitely something that we that would be good to look at in the future. On your point, I was only looking at the Jaku and Chikicha constructions, so I can only speak to the use of those morphological structures. But yeah, it does look like from the data that children are starting to sort of use them interchangeably without a difference between them, which is an interesting feature of language change. But it would always be great to have more data from older children to see whether they're carrying that through to adult speech as well. Or maybe this is just them as kids getting their head around the language, being, just figuring it out. That's, of course, a possibility. Yeah.
And is this research for young kids, has it only been used for Pitjantjatjara, or is there other language groups that you've used?
Personally, only for Pitjantjatjara, but there has been in the last few years quite a few different language acquisition studies. For example, a researcher called Bill Forshaw has done some work on a language called Murunpata, how children are acquiring Murunpata, which is a grammatically quite different language.
It's so different.
Yeah.
It's very unique. I've heard Murunpata as a language of its own.
Yeah. So you know, it's very different, but there are still interesting comparisons, the way that children approach the learning challenge of like really complex words. You know, what we think of when we think of Murrumpata is really complex words, and it's like, how does a 2-year-old get their head around noun incorporation and interesting stuff like that? So yeah, but personally, yeah, just Pitjantjatjara and just Pukaja Pitjantjatjara. Like, it could be different in other places as well.
And I also mentioned like in Western Aranda, there's a lot of, because there used to be a German missionary, their languages now merge with German and Western Aranda. So most of the littler kids are actually not speaking the pure language, they're actually speaking German.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's you know, that's from 60, 70 years ago, but it's still the littler kids are talking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, going back to that point about is this just kids getting their head around the morphology of Pitjantjatjara, or is this like a language change? The argument in favour of it being a more widespread language change is that we are seeing that breakdown in distinction between Chikitja and Jaku in adult speech as well, that's been recorded by Wilmoth, for instance. If this was just a feature of child speech that they fix up as they get older, we might expect it to, we wouldn't expect to see that breakdown in distinction in adult speech as well.
I think it would depend on what they're hearing at home though as well.
Absolutely,
like,
yeah.
If mum and dad are using the whole thing, then that's what they're going to pick up. If mum and dad are dropping that unstressed part of the more complex suffix, then they're going to drop it as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right, which is why it would be great to have some child-directed speech data to see what what sort of forms children are exposed to, and also the frequency of different forms. Because one of the questions is, if there's a breakdown in distinction between the Chikitja and Jaku, why does the Gu seem to be winning out? Like, why is the Gu edging out the Gitja, which is what we see because the date of marked insubordinate clauses are more frequent than the intent of marked insubordinate clauses.
Gu has got to do with genitive as well, you know, like.
And the goal.
Yeah,
that's it.
It's like
Purpose
me.
and goal.
I'm mentioning me, cool. It's cool. Like,
Yeah.
Jaku, like as we walking, I am going to walk. So
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I think.
I might do it, but Kitcha and cool mixed together is cool.
Yeah. I mean, mine. Yeah. I think that's actually right. I think Gu just has more uses.
Yeah.
And so Gitja, it's just not appearing as frequently. Children are exposed to Jaku, and so if they're needing to go with one, they go with the more frequent one. But once again, yeah, it would be good to have some child-directed speech
I
data.
was speaking to a linguist 4 years ago who had worked in South Australia a lot. He was much older when I was talking to him. It was one of those weird situations where someone around the language and looking for something, and we ended up having a whole other conversation. But he was saying to me that, you know, you might say, "No, Jackie, I'm Jackie," but he had seen that the younger kids were saying, "No, Jackie,"
Right.
and so there was that switch there, like between, you know, the ergative towards agentative. So I mean, that's what I always think about that, you know, when we talk about things like that, and why it's good switching out. I always remember that conversation I had with
Yeah, so they're going from Umbu just from the ergative just to.
So there's a Naidu, I am.
Yeah.
Or Naidu, mine. So you would say Naidu, Jackie, I'm Jackie.
Yeah.
But the younger, these kids he was working with, he was noticing that they started saying Naidu, Jackie, I'm Jackie. So they are swapping out the ergative and using.
That's interesting because, like, you do hear Ngaigu as like my.
Yeah, mine.
So like.
So my name.
My
is,
name.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yes.
Really nice talk. I think that the research is very clear, and I thought your presentation was really great. I've got two comments.
Please.
In your preamble, you talked about the narrowness of the range of languages that are first language acquisition people have worked on. There's a further narrowness, which is a focus on dominant middle class family context.
Yeah.
So in the case of English, it's basically white North American middle class people. For Japanese, it's middle class people again. So not only is it narrow in terms of the range of languages, it's narrow in terms of the range of sociological contexts in which those languages are used. So we might well expect Australian Indigenous languages to show differences because of the sociological context in which they're being used, and the fact that they're, it's a fourth world situation with a minority community.
That's a good point. Oh, the only thing I'll say about that is that something that goes with that is that the conventions of child-directed speech are culturally contingent.
Absolutely.
So, once again, when we're speaking, the Inuktitut example, it's a good example from a smaller language, but a lot of our assumptions about the way child-directed speech works are based on a Western model of the sort of mother-child relationship most of the time, and that, as you say, may well be different for other cultural contexts.
What I've heard from people that work on Walbury is that basically parents, caregivers don't talk to children until they're at a point at which they actually can understand what's going on.
That's
so it's not child-directed speech at all until they're like 3 or 4 years old.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I've heard of that in a few
that.
parts of the world.
Wow.
And the other thing with Japanese is child-directed speech is oriented more towards the content of what the child is producing than the form of the. So the parents are paying attention to what the kid is attempting to communicate rather than any grammatical or lexical or other kind of aspect. So as you say, there are sociological and cross-cultural differences there as well.
Yeah.
My second comment is your token numbers are absolutely tiny.
Yes.
And I think you probably want to hedge your claims about, it shows this, and after 3 years, 6 months, it shows that, and so on.
Yeah.
Because your numbers are 2, 3, 4 tokens.
Absolutely.
You have thousands of clauses. So.
Yeah. It is. That's just a challenge with research, is that you intend to research one thing and you look and it's just not there, or it's there in very small numbers, and that's interesting in and of itself. But yeah, you're right. It does mean you have to qualify any conclusions that you make.
No, it's an argument for, as you were saying at the very end, it's an argument for more data collection.
That's right.
And very varied kinds of data collection. So what you said about collecting child-directed speech as well.
I'll also just say on that sampling bias question, not only is there a massive sampling bias towards certain languages, there's a massive bias towards certain topics in first language acquisition as well. So the focus on syntax and the acquisition of syntax has been overwhelming, probably as a result of basically Noam Chomsky and the generative debate wanting to find evidence for certain inbuilt cognitive structures through the prevalence or the presence of syntactic structures in child speech. But the investigation of the pragmatics or the phonology of child speech is something that still needs to be researched in many different ways.
I thought it was really cool that the kids were applying pragmatics, seem to be applying pragmatics quite early, and its modality aspect of pragmatics, so the use of these verb forms to express wishing.
That's right. Please.
I guess I just was wondering if well, the corpus was collected by those backpacks, right, that you were using. Were those able to pick up the people that the children were speaking to and who were speaking to the children? So, like, did that pick up child-directed speech?
It picked up a very small amount of child-directed speech that to date hasn't been transcribed.
Right.
So, but it's not a really useful amount of child-directed speech. The main focus was on the child speech. Not only were the children's speech recorded, but there was also a little camera attached to their backpacks as well, which gave an insight into some of the sort of non-verbal ways of communicating amongst children and caregivers as well. So there's some interesting stuff there. But unfortunately, no, there's not a great deal of child-directed speech data that you can glean from the recordings.
But I guess theoretically that method could be used to collect child-directed speech.
Yeah, I think so.
It's microphones and stuff are sensitive enough to.
That's another point, I guess, with your preamble is when you say child-directed, what does that mean? And cross-culturally, that varies enormously. So, is it parents or adults who are doing the caregiving, or is it older siblings?
That's right.
In many communities, that expectation is that it's the older siblings who are, and so the language that they are producing is relevant in terms of what the little kids are creating as against, say, adult speech, for example. I had a PhD student who did research on a language in Algeria, very isolated oasis location. Language is called Baranji, and the majority context was Arabic. Okay, so what he discovered was that there were a bunch of kids. It wasn't an acquisition study, and it's anecdotal, but he found that there were a bunch of kids whose parents were insisting on the use of Arabic, and the kids were exposed to Arabic in the house and in the classroom and so on. Once they were outside of the house, they would go out and they'd play with their friends and so on. So around the age of 8 to 10, they were mixing sort of socially, and what the kids were speaking outside was Gwaranji. It wasn't Arabic. So the acquisition of Gwaranji didn't take place until they started mixing with the next sort of cohort.
That's very interesting. I mean, even anecdotally, we've heard, most of us would have heard of people who have small children and move overseas, and the kids go to preschool overseas and come home speaking with an American or a UK accent because they're still acquiring their first language. All of their peers, if they're in the UK, have an English accent maybe. And so even though the parents are speaking to the children with an Australian English accent, the children acquire a British accent, which is, it's an interesting point.
Hey, that's really interesting. Were they, like, so from the age of 7 or 8, they were interacting with other children about 7 or 8, and they learned a whole other language. I
So they're in a bilingual situation where, I mean, the parents speak Gwaranji and Arabic, but they refuse to speak to the children in anything but Arabic. They want the kids to learn proper Arabic.
So they don't know Gwaranji at all?
Sorry?
So the kids didn't know Gwaranji at all? They must have known a little bit.
What he observed was that they were not actively using it until the age of 5 or 6, when they started to go out and, because people live in kind of a compound where there are multiple extended families living together. So the children, their early life was spent entirely within the compound. But then after they went out to play, the teenagers, it was the language that teenagers chose to speak. And so that's what the kids were acquiring.
Okay.
But this is anecdotal, it's not based on empirical research.
Yeah, because I always thought that, and this is off Felix's topic, but I always thought that when you go to school, as a child, when you go to school, that's the first time that your language is being scaffolded. So when you're at home with mum and dad and grandma, whatever, your language is being scaffolded. when you go to interact with your peers, they don't understand you, they're going to talk to you, they're going to try and they don't care scaffold, so it's sink or swim. So I find that a bit opposite to what I always thought. But yeah, interesting.
Great, thanks for your questions.
Very, very clear and logical progression.
Thanks, Felix. It was
Are
really
you
good.
going to do any more work in this area, Felix, you think? Or see what happens?
On this particular topic,
Yeah.
I would be interested, but there's no like firm plans at the moment. Yeah, but it's an interesting topic. The first language acquisition of Australian languages definitely in the future.